chapter 1, verses 4 to 20. Samuel's birth and dedication. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on, year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow: "O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head." As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favour in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I have asked him of the Lord." The New Testament reading is from Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 8. The destruction of the Temple Foretold. As he came out of the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This is the living word.
Today, we get to dip our toes into 1 Samuel. So I thought I'd begin with providing some hopefully interesting information about the setting and the background of the book. So we'll take it right back, because I was interested to learn that Samuel was discovered as a lengthy scroll among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Coming for the grandchildren. And that was referred to as 4Q Sam. This scroll indicates that what we know as 1 and 2 Samuel actually belong together in a single Hebrew book. It suggested that it was at some point during the early Christian era that they were divided into 2 books as we know them today. 2 traditions are found within the text of 1 and 2 Samuel, those being the tradition of monarchy and prophetic. The books belong to the body of text known as the former prophets. It's set in the end of the period of Judges, which was a time of great changes in political, social and religious life, described as a theopolitical story where the realm of politics and religion were thoroughly intertwined. The hope was that an alternative kind of leader would emerge, and this leader would be one who would rule with justice and begin to order the world in accordance with the values and the economy of God. While not included in the lectionary reading this morning, the first 3 verses introduce us to the narrative. They provide us with a little bit of genealogy for Elkanah, and we're related to the fact that he engaged in the system of polygyny. He had 2 wives. Both were named. They're Peninnah, and she had children, and then there's Hannah, who did not. We're told that each year Elkanah would make the journey to Shiloh, which was located in central Palestine, midway between Shechem and Bethel. The purpose being to worship and sacrifice. The place he would go, obviously with his wives and children, is suggested to be the simple shrine of Eli, where Eli's sons, Ophni and Phinehas, were priests. And if we continue to read on, we learn that these sons were not particularly pleasant, as we're told that they practiced in greed and corruption. Anywho, that's the basic context of our reading this morning. And we enter the text on the day that Elkanah sacrificed. Immediately, we're alerted to the fact that while Peninnah and her children were given portions, Hannah was given double because he loved her, even though her womb was closed. And it's here that we're introduced to the theme of barrenness. And again, it's important to remember that this text is located within an ancient patriarchal world, where the identity and role of women was to basically bear children, preferably sons. In this world, barrenness was pure and simply seen as divine punishment for sin. Alan Bosek suggests, barrenness is the way of human history without God. Hopelessness, powerlessness, joylessness. To be without a future and without human power to invent future. This was Hannah's way in this world. Her barrenness became the foundation of severe provocation delivered by Peninnah, the result being Hannah's weeping and refusal to eat. Now, Elkanah's response to Hannah could be understood as sincerely sympathetic. However, if we think about it, I think it's fair to say his response is a little bit clumsy, and we could even go so far as to say it was a little self-centered, because he's almost saying, am I not enough? Poor Elkanah. He's failing to hear her deep distress and the reality of her situation. While he may indeed love her, she was unable to fulfill her role in this world. And if Hannah was to find herself as a widow, she would be dependent upon the goodwill of Peninnah and her sons, and so far that's not looking particularly positive. Hannah leaves, and we hear that in her deep distress, she prayed and wept bitterly. She makes a vow, calling for God to look upon her misery, and she identifies herself as God's Amma, maid or handmaid, and asks that she be given a male child. Hannah goes on to promise that she will set said male child before God as a Nazarite until his death. Now this in and of itself is quite extraordinary, because this was a vow that was only taken usually for a limited time. The text continues stating that he shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. And so at this point, I thought it was appropriate for a little Hebrew interlude. The Hebrew text contains no reference to Nazir, which is Nazarite. And it makes reference only to the most obvious restriction involved with the Nazarite vow, and that is that no razor will touch his head. And so at this point, it's really good for us to understand that the NRSV was produced after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so it was able to take advantage of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient manuscripts as they were discovered. And it suggested that the NRSV contains some 100 corrections, and they're marked with a Q in the footnote. Anywho, back to the text. That was a little interesting note for you, wasn't it? Eli was in the background, observing Hannah, who was praying silently, leading him to the conclusion she was drunk. Hannah responds, telling Eli that she's been pouring out her soul, that she's speaking out of great anxiety and vexation. Eli basically blesses her. And interestingly here, Hannah, in her response to Eli, refers to herself now as Shifkar. And if you recall from last week, this term indicates that Hannah doesn't consider herself to be a potential candidate for marriage or concubinage, whereas the Amma that she uses earlier does. So maybe this is actually expressing her absolute exasperation with this situation. That said, as we arrive at the conclusion of our reading, Hannah does conceive and bear a son, whom she names Samuel. The optional 1 Samuel reading for this morning sees Hannah move from a place of silence as she utters a new prayer aloud, with a theme of reversal in which God raises the lowly and brings down those from high places, which will explain the hymn that I've chosen for after the message. We'll see this theme again in the New Testament, except on that occasion it will come from the lips of Mary as she sings the Magnificat. Any woman who has longed for a child, anyone who's longed for a child, will connect deeply to the anguish of Hannah, the depth of her emptiness, the broken dreams. In her cultural context, Hannah would have been left with a feeling of shame, worthlessness, and even perhaps uselessness. In her distress, she has no voice. She prays silently, which wasn't the practice of Israelites. If we consider barrenness beyond the ability to conceive, we can see how this story weaves its way through our communities and our world. So many people feel empty, devoid of joy and hope, plunged into positions of powerlessness and silenced by systems, structures, and our very culture. Because there is still often a rhetoric that suggests our value is based upon what we produce for society. We hear the judgment placed upon Hannah by Eli, and we can all shake our heads, but it's easy to pass judgment. I wonder, in the reading this morning, did we jump to the conclusion that Peninnah was basically nasty, provoking and taunting Hannah in her despair? Did we for a moment pause and reflect to consider Peninnah's situation? To consider her potential deep hair? She too was a woman in the same cultural context. She had fulfilled society's and indeed her husband's expectation to produce children which included males. And yet from this text, it seems she was unloved and unfavoured by Elkanah. In Eli's judgment, he failed to hear Hannah's anguish, the pouring out of her soul, the depth of her despair. And I wonder, what do we fail to hear? Do we fail to hear the anguish and the emptiness of the people who are homeless, who have lost their job, who have lost a loved one? Do we fail to hear the people who are crying out for justice? Do we fail to hear the people who call from the margins of our community and pour out their souls in hopelessness, joylessness, and powerlessness? In our privilege, do we fail to recognise or look to the barren spaces of our community and world, believing that the people in those spaces will produce nothing? Again, I quote Alan Bozak. He says, "As Yahweh steps into the hopeless, barren void and speaks a word of life, which gives life to God's promises and creates a future for God's people, a major victory is won over the forces of death and despair." If we consider the story of Hannah, and before her, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, we see that in their despair, God enters into the barrenness and gives life. In this time and place, and with these examples in mind, let's not ignore the radical God we worship. Because God chose women in pivotal moments in history. Women who were not valued in this patriarchal world. God chose women to carry forward the story of God's salvific action in the world, to carry forward the hope. The radical God that we worship is not bound by our judgments or artificial barriers of our cultures, systems and structures. If we consider the Mark reading this morning, it's often referred to as the little apocalypse or synoptic apocalypse. It ends with the words of hope, as Jesus declares, "This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Now, any woman who has laboured would know that birth pangs are not pain-free, and nor are they anguish-free. It's a time of hope, and admittedly, sometimes distress. But the hope is that new life will lay in their arms. As disciples of Jesus, we're called to be his presence in our community and world, to carry forward the hope. Hannah's prayer of reversal which follows is a prayer of hope. It's a prayer of revolution and a call for change. Still today for us, it's a reminder that we are the unlikely called to participate in working for reversal, to dismantle the barriers and destructive systems that keep people in places of pain and suffering. It's a call to remember that God turns up in the barren spaces filled with the silenced. It's a call to listen and to persevere in the work of Jesus. Even in the moments when we feel that no fruit will be born and our prayers will be unanswered. It's our prayer, and a prayer of hope for all people who dwell in the barren spaces of this world. Let's pray. Holy promise, you turn up in the least expected places and least expected people. Send your Spirit upon us to open our ears to the silenced, to open our eyes to the barren spaces, to open our hearts to offer love and compassion to those in our midst that feel unloved and unworthy. Let us be your people, the hands, feet, mind and heart of Jesus in the world. Amen.